the suspect in these targeted shootings, and over the weekend, both facing state and federal charges. We know that the federal case is the one that will move forward first, and there was so much information that came out yesterday in a federal affidavit, just a lot of details about what happened, what authorities believe happened that morning, including, the suspect stopping at 4 lawmakers' homes, not 2. It was Champlin, Maple Grove, New Hope, Brooklyn Park. We also learned that after the deadly attacks, he bought a car from someone and an e-bike. Someone he just met at a Minneapolis bus stop, went to the bank, actually took out money to buy these things. And then that was the car that was eventually found abandoned in Sibley County, which was one of the big pieces that moved them forward to start, kind of concentrating more in that area. And then, of course, that's where he was apprehended near his home in Green Isle. So he is in federal custody right now, be in court again on June 27th. So again, there are these state charges, and then there are the federal charges. And again, a lot of information that came out yesterday. We really didn't get a chance, though, to understand what those federal charges mean and the consequences for those. So joining me now is Steve Dettelbach, former ATF director, as well as former U.S. attorney. Thank you for joining us, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
So first, I got to ask you right at the top here, I'm curious what's kind of been going through your mind as you've been following the events of the last 3 days here in Minnesota.
Probably not that much different as what's been going through everybody's mind. Horror. This is just a terrible, horrible, evil thing that has happened, and sympathy to the victims and survivors. And then also I think gratitude. One of the things that came out in the documents you talked about is law enforcement did an incredible job in this matter, making sure that even more people weren't hurt or killed.
Yeah.
That is right. There were 2 other locations apparently, and one of them, the person was actually confronted while sort of sitting outside there.
Yeah. It's the more we learn, the more horrific it becomes. But also, you're right. There are these places that were so important, pivotal as law enforcement was doing their work. 43-hour search, the largest, in Minnesota history. We wanted to, if we could, break down the federal case a little bit more with you, just in very sort of simple terms. So, can you help us understand what this suspect is charged with on the federal side, and then also the penalties he'd be facing there?
Okay, so first of all, it's early in the process, right? In the legal process. So what's happened so far is that a complaint was filed. That's usually the way in the federal system that you, before you seek an indictment, if you have to act quickly because there's a bad guy that you've caught, the way you bring charges quickly is you file a complaint. And the complaint in this case charges a few different things. It charges federal stalking crimes, and then also federal firearms crimes related to those stalking crimes. What will happen now is that the investigation will continue. You saw in the complaint some things that were directly related to the actual murders, which are charged obviously in state court also. You also saw some things that are related to the ongoing investigation of why and how and what this person did to plan and then execute these crimes. And then you also saw some things that are sort of related to some of the jurisdiction as to why there can be a federal case in what's called the interstate stalking statute. One of them is the use of the internet. So you saw some things in that complaint that talked about how this individual used the internet to do research, went on various platforms to do research. And so that is one of the hooks that they're using, at least now, at this early stage, to establish that federal jurisdiction. Now, the charges will then go to a grand jury. And a grand jury will both investigate further and will be asked to bring additional charges, maybe the same ones, maybe different ones. And so there's now a period of time where the federal government and state law enforcement has to work together to figure out what the best charges are and what the best place to do the case is. You also mentioned penalties. One of the things that is available for some cases in the federal system is capital punishment, the death penalty, right? And I'm not from Minnesota, but my understanding is that that's not available ordinarily in the state in Minnesota. So there's that potential difference. But we're really at the beginning here, most important thing that law enforcement is thinking about now is protecting the victims and protecting the broader community and getting this guy off the street, making sure that there was no other people involved. They'll be doing all of those things. And the other feeling, though, that I just can't help but say, Amber, is just a feeling of frustration, which I'm sure we are all having. We have this. I spent a lot of time in Minneapolis when I was ATF director because, like so many cities, there's just a constant pounding of gun violence that is going on throughout our country, almost uniquely in the world, maybe actually uniquely in the world. And we also now, on top of that, have this, constant flow of political violence.
Yeah.
And, the combination of those two things was on display for the people of, your state and the people of this country and world to see, which is you have this vindictive, evil person who is armed to the teeth.
Yeah.
And kills people.
Steve, one of the many hard things here for just people, ordinary people, as they look at this, I think, is to try to separate, not normalizing this, but also feeling like is this where we are as a society? I mean, how do you rectify those two?
Yeah, so you are so right about not normalizing this, right? I mean, I feel like sometimes, and this is merely talking as a father in addition to a prosecutor and law enforcement person, that there's so much of this violence, this people shooting each other, this everywhere, that it is sort of a defense mechanism as you become callous to it, right? Because you can't sort of get your head around the fact that you could be sitting at home as a public official or walking down the block as an ordinary citizen, and your life could be ended so quickly. But we cannot become numb to it, because if we become numb to it and accept it, we've lost, right? We have to maintain our sense of outrage and shock every time we see this. And yes, it applies when a horrible assassination like this happens, but it also applies, in the Twin Cities when the gang I came up there on with your U.S. Attorney, Andy Lugar, at that time was the Hive, right? And they shot 24 people, right? And so there's just this constant pummeling, and we cannot become numb to it. So I think that's absolutely, to me, actually, that's probably my greatest fear for our country now, is that we somehow stop getting outraged and things get more, and you see it escalates more and more and more. And what does it take to basically, grab our attention?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about some of the possible punishments here. You mentioned capital punishment, and of course, that's the one, understandably, that some people are going to just go right to and gravitate to and say, yes, that's what needs to happen. It's not something we talk a lot about here in Minnesota, to your point, because it's not something that Minnesota does. Is there anything you can kind of tell us, and again, set the expectation here. We're early on. But what can you tell us about the process of how that happens? How is it decided, if life or death? What does that look like? Where does that person go? I think we just have so many questions about what that looks like.
So a whole bunch of things. So first, in order. First, there has to be a statute, a law that Congress passed that provides for capital punishment. There's not some general capital punishment. It's law by law. So in this case, they've invoked a series of laws that has capital punishment attached to some of those provisions, at least to start with. Second, there has to be a charging decision made, and there's this very specific process both at the U.S. Attorney's Office and at the Maine Department of Justice in Washington, where there's a review group that reviews to see whether, even if it falls under that statute, it has the right, what's called aggravating and mitigating factors. So there's set forth in the law these aggravating factors, things that you should make it more likely to be a capital case, and then there's some mitigating factors, and they'll look at all of those things. After that, it'll go to court, and the first people there'll be a whole bunch of motions, and the judge will decide certain legal things, but the jury in the federal system gets to decide whether to impose capital punishment. It has to be a unanimous decision by the jury to do that. And then, of course, after that, there's a series of reviews by the courts to make sure that everything was done in accordance with the law. It's a very specific and detailed process where we try to make sure that the laws are followed in assessing the matter as to whether it's a capital case or not.
How common or rare is it for someone to be sentenced to have that capital punishment sentence?
These things ebb and flow over time. It is not common for a person to be executed in the federal system. That's not something that happens often because most murders, not all, but most murders are done in the state system. The state police, the state police in Minnesota, the Minneapolis-St. Paul police, the police in these cities, and the local prosecutors in Hennepin County, they're the ones who usually handle murder cases.
Yeah. Let me ask you about something I've heard people talking about is insanity defense at play here, and what would that look like? What could it mean on the federal side of things?
Well, again, it's early to know what defenses, what legal defenses will be asserted. I mean, it doesn't look like there's a ton of factual defenses at play, so there'll be probably legal defenses. Look, I mean, anytime somebody does a horrible thing like this, you could say, oh my gosh, that person must be crazy. There must be something wrong with them. But that does not mean that there is an insanity defense under the law. The law requires a very specific thing and a very specific set of facts. And it basically amounts to the fact of whether the person can prove that they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know right from wrong at the time that this happened. And when you look at a case, and it's very preliminary, where somebody wears a disguise, where somebody tries to elude detection and capture afterwards, that doesn't seem at first blush to be consistent with somebody who didn't understand that what they were doing was wrong and illegal, right? Yeah. The reason you wear a disguise is because you don't want to get caught. The reason you don't want to get caught is because you know what you're going to do is against the law. Those things don't flush, at least on first blush, with an insanity defense. But of course, there'll be defense attorneys and prosecutors and investigators and maybe even mental health professionals who will have more to say about it.
Okay. Another just sort of layman question here. Is there any opportunity for bargaining power on the suspect side of things? Any sort of deals to be cut potentially?
Again, I would have been able to answer that question in my last job, but I wouldn't have been willing to do it.
Yeah.
And now I'm not able to answer it because the only people who really understand these things, first of all, it's way too early for that, are the people who are handling the case on both sides. Look, part of it depends upon what the strength of the evidence is in the case. Part of it depends on whether there's a legal defense of some sort in the case. Part of it depends upon the nature and seriousness of the crime. I mean, obviously that's going to be a big factor here, Amber, right? I mean, this is not the kind of case where where leniency is usually in the minds of the prosecutors and law enforcement. And it depend on what the potential penalties are.
Speaking of penalties, can I ask you, again, not kind of knowing this world, are there higher penalties anywhere in there if someone targets, say, an elected official? And if not, should there be?
Well, so all of those kinds of things go to the intent, right? The motivation of the person. And in the federal system, there are some circumstances where a person's intent can lead to higher penalties. For instance, terrorism, right? When somebody commits an act of terrorism, they're also committing a murder. But we sometimes punish the terrorism at higher levels because there's an additional notion of trying to affect and impact and scare the public at large in addition to the crime. Hate crimes. Hate crimes can have enhancements. Actually, Minnesota was a state that sort of pioneered that, right? With enhanced based on the motivation. Whether that exists in this case or not, whether there is enough evidence to charge one of these crimes that has this additional intent, I think we're not anywhere near that yet. But I would point out one thing, which is the stalking offense in and of itself, right, requires additional elements besides just the murder, right? It requires, in this case, the cyber stalking requires the use of these kinds of pre-planned internet devices, right, in order to sort of create this crime. And as we know, at least from what was in the complaint, right, there was a longer list of people, even beyond the 4 homes that are in the complaint that were visited, of individuals who might have been, at risk. And so as somebody who's had to deal with that myself, and his family's had to deal with it myself, right? I just want to say to the entire public service community, the people who are out there sort of sticking their necks out, they bargain for a lot. They bargain for getting really sometimes silly commercials run about against them in election season, and people yelling at them in town hall meetings, and all that's part of what you bargain for. But this is not. And this increase in political violence and people thinking that somehow because you are in the state legislature or federal legislature or run for president, or are president, or a director of a law enforcement agency, you and your family are somehow fair game. It is absolutely anti-American. And I think, it's one thing we can all come together on. It is absolutely a necessity that we stop this political violence in our country.
Yeah. Former ATF Director and former U.S. Attorney Steve Dettelbach, we really appreciate your time today and your insights, helping us understand the federal side of this. We have Andy Luger coming in on Friday. I'll make sure and say hello from you.
Make sure you say hello to Andy for me too.
I will. All right. Take care. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.